Hey everyone, welcome back to the shop. Got working on some projects. Didn't have a lot of time to film. The department had been without machinists for some time because there was no overlap. So I had to kind of jump in and get some stuff done. The parts are pretty simple. Started using some of the equipment and found some problems with it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what was wrong with each of the machines and how I was able to kind of get stuff working. Again, I wasn't able to film any of that. I didn't really have a setup for the camera, which actually I made a little plate for, and I'll throw a little drawing up of that. But so I got that set up. The way was pretty dry on it. So I got that lubed up and everything, but everything was real tight. The carriage, you barely can move the carriage at all. This lathe has kind of a drive motor to feed the cross slide and the carriage, and that wasn't able to do it. It's got some friction clutches in there, and those were slipping, so none of the power feeds were working on it. So I took a look at that and tried to get that repaired, but the biggest issue was the tailstock. The tailstock, you couldn't turn it at all. It was completely frozen. So when I discovered that, I was like, okay, maybe it's something simple. So I took the tailstock apart, hoping I would just find some chips or something built up in there and just needing a good cleaning. But what I found was there were a lot of problems with the tailstock. I had to take it all apart and get in there and do some work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and take the tailstock apart again and just kind of show some of the things that I had to do to get it to where it's working pretty good now. And it was a fair bit of work to get it going, and that was just so I could use the machine to make some parts. So that was kind of a thing that I wasn't really expecting with the equipment. Just go back to the carriage. I was able to get this going, made an adjustment on the gib and loosened that up quite a bit, and now it works pretty good. It still has a little bit of tightness here, and I'm going to have to look at that a little bit more, but for the most part it seems to be working okay. So I'm going to go ahead and bring it back after I get this tailstock taken apart. Okay, so I got this apart as far as we need to take it, just to kind of show what I had to go through and fix. I'm going to go ahead and leave the Acme threaded shaft and the bearing and stuff in there because all that stuff was fine. I will say though, I took this off the tool stock off the lathe, or the tailstock off, and then worked on it on the bench, and one of the things I found was some screws were missing, so I knew that someone had already been into it, which is always kind of a warning sign. The other thing I found is the tailstock, the quill here, was so tight in the tailstock housing itself that I had to get a piece of aluminum rod and actually drive this out. So that was kind of a indication that there was a problem, and there was probably a problem from day one with the machine and it being that tight. So what I did was I took this the shaft out here and I put it in the South Bend lathe, and I started to kind of sand it just to kind of take some of the, if there's any burrs or anything that was catching on it in the housing. I couldn't find anything, but one of the things I found right away is the South Bend lathe has some issues too, so the tailstock in it was also messed up, so I was kind of stuck. So the other thing too is this is got kind of a chrome plating on it, so it's pretty hard, so there was no way that I was going to take any appreciable amount of material off of it. So what I ended up doing is inspecting this carefully, and the shaft, the threaded Acme shaft in here was fine. The bearings were okay. The next thing I did was I measured the shaft and the opening here, and they, it was almost like an interference fit. They were almost the same within a couple tenths. So again, this to me says that this was an issue from day one. So what I did was I mounted this guy up on the bench over there, and I used one of these ball hones. These things are pretty good. They don't remove a lot of material, but they kind of preserve geometry. So if you have a bore that is nice and straight, and you use these guys, you're not going to really have it go off axis or kind of bell mouth it or anything. But they're good for taking small amounts of material off. And so what I ended up doing is using this in the housing until I got a nice fit with the shaft in there, and it's a good fit now where there's very little play at all, and it slides in and out nice and easily. And I think that was the only issue with it. But because this was so hard to turn, this is the part that came out of the back here of the tailstock quill, and there's another bushing in there, and this has got threads into here. Well, these threads were pretty messed up, pretty chowdered, and the Acme thread inside was also kind of messed up too. So what I did with those is I just went and I made another part to replace that. We had some brass material. I think the original might have been bronze, but I think brass is going to work okay for our use here. So I had to thread the outside, and this was a metric 1 millimeter pitch, and this is like an oddball size, so it was kind of I couldn't get like a die or anything, so I had to single point this. And then I got an Acme left hand thread 5/8 tap, and I went ahead and created the threads inside, and also kind of refreshed the threads on the tailstock quill. So once I did all that stuff, I thought I was in the clear, but I found that the threads here on the inside or the end of the quill for the tailstock, these were damaged. And that was a problem because I don't have really a way to chase those with the tools I have. The lathe that I'm working on, I'm trying to fix the tailstock, so I couldn't support this. I don't have a steady rest for it, and the South Bend I can't cut metric threads. So what I ended up doing with it is using one of these thread files here. These things actually work pretty good. This is for external thread, and then on the end of it, it has internal threads. So with this, I was able to kind of restore those threads to get that bushing to kind of go in and thread in there. And once I did that, again, I thought, okay, everything's done, I can put it back together. I had a problem with getting the threaded shaft to go in here and start, and it would get tight. And I ran the tap through, and it ran through okay. So I was like, what's going on here? Well, as it turns out, there's a set screw here that locks this bushing in. And what had happened is this is in pretty deep. If you take this out and look at it, you can see where they actually went through the bushing inside there. So what was happening is the shaft was getting hung up on the set screw. So I took it and loosened that a little bit and didn't tension it as much, and everything kind of went together fine. So that's kind of what I did with the tailstock. And again, it's kind of weird. I don't know how you were using this before with it in the condition that it was, because you couldn't turn it and it was so tight. and I saw that there was, you know, a screw missing, so I know that whoever had it before was, you know, got in there to take a look at it. But I guess at that point they kind of stopped, and they went to different methods of using the lathe to drill, which you know, you can do in a pinch. So that's kind of what I did to get this tailstock going. I thought I'd share that with everyone to kind of go through the steps that I went to kind of get it back into shape. Now the carriage, I got the tailstock back together. Again, this had issues, you barely can move it, and at first I was hoping that it was just the way it needed to be lubricated, but as I got into it a little bit more and cleaned the way up and lubed it really well, I discovered that the one-shot oiler had a leak in it, so I had to take that off and take care of that. The hose was loose. Got that working, and still the carriage was really tight, so I went in and took the back cover off here and went in and adjusted the gib, and it's a lot better now. I think I might need to loosen it a little bit more. When we get near the headstock, it gets a little bit tight, which is not quite making sense to me, because I would think it would be loose here, because this is where you're doing most of your work. And as you get further away from the headstock, it loosens up, so I'll have to think a little bit about that. Once I got that gib adjusted, then the power feed for the carriage worked a lot better. It still has some issues. It will stop every once in a while. There's a friction clutch in here, and this is an oil bath gearbox, and it's low on oil. I need to get some. The interesting thing with that is the oil that they call out for is kind of discontinued. So I did some fishing around and found a non-detergent oil that has the close viscosity to what was in there before, and we'll go ahead and just put that in there. I'm hoping that the clutches themselves aren't worn out. If they are, I might have to see if I can get parts for it. This is, by the way, I think I mentioned it before, but this is an AML 618, which is a knockoff on the Hardinge HLV-V tool room lathe. So this one I think originally was purchased from MSC. When I contacted them, they said they haven't sold these since '94, and I'm kind of out of luck on them for getting parts from them. So carriage is all working good. I did tighten up, the compound gib was a little bit loose, so I tightened that up a little bit so wasn't so sloppy, and less likely when you bump it to move it, because that's happened to me already. I bumped it and it turned so easily, it moved the compound in. And the cross slide works pretty well. That gib didn't need any adjustment, and the power feed works fine on that. So that's kind of it on the lathe. There's some other stuff I need to look at. The headstock here has got a little bit of noise, and the bearings in it are like permanently greased, so there's no like grease ports or anything on it. So I might look at getting in there and having a look at that. And the quick change, you guys over a little bit, the quick change gearbox, this is a little bit tight too, and you can't really get at the gears. There's a cover here, and all of this is kind of behind this cover, so all of this has to come off to get at those, and they probably could use a little bit of oil on them, because it is kind of a little stiff to get everything dialed in when you're cutting threads. So for the most part, the lathe is functional enough for what we need here. There are some things I want to get the oil changed in here and hopefully get this drive working a little bit more reliably, and that should be it on this. It'll be working well enough for what we need here. Okay, we're over here by the Bridgeport, and I needed this for more parts to make, and primarily I needed this more than the lathe. I did need the lathe for a couple parts, but this is the one I needed to be working right off the bat, and for the most part it is. It's in pretty good shape. It's fairly new. I think it's probably less than 4 or 5 years old. One of the things I did was got the way covers installed. They're kind of tight with the DRO in the back and everything, so I could see why you may not want to put them on, but it took a little fiddling, but I got them on there. I wanted to try and keep that stuff covered. The Y-axis on this guy, again, is really tight, so I need to get in there and adjust the give on the Y. They probably were trying to take some of the play out of it. It's really tight machine. I mean, it's practically brand new. So I'm kind of wondering why they had that give so tight. It may have been that way from the factory, and they just kind of used it as is. So I'm going to get in there and adjust it a little bit, because it's fairly tight. This mill has a Y-axis speed, which is, again, something I've never had. I've always just had the X-axis, so it's nice, and I use it a lot. It works good. The handles are a little bit tight here with proximity to the knee crank and stuff, but for the most part it works okay. But you can hear it kind of labor a little bit when it gets the table in, so I'll adjust that give. The other thing, I have to laugh too, I was hoping when I saw this and when I took the job that, you know, this is a Bridgeport, and one of the things at the last couple places I've worked, there's a pin in here for your R8 collet. I think everyone's seen these before, where they have the little groove in them, and the pin is in the spindle here, and it's designed to prevent this from rotating at all. And you know, if you go online or whatever, there's, you know, some guys take the pins out, some say, you know, no, you need it, and stuff like that. Well, the last two places I worked at, both the pins, one of them got mangled pretty bad because they had a power drawbar, and what was happening is people didn't have this quill all the way up when they're hitting the drawbar, and it just destroyed that pin. And getting a replacement for that was a Turn Pro clone. That was kind of tricky because they didn't copy it exactly, and the threads weren't the same as what they are in the Bridgeport. The other place I just worked at recently, they had a Sharp mill, and that pin was in too far, so certain collets wouldn't fit in at all. So I adjusted that one so all the collets fit, and so I get to this one thinking, oh, you know, it's going to work great. You know, the mill hasn't been used that much. Well, the pin needs to be adjusted on this, and the problem with this pin is I'm reaching in here now and I feel it, and I looked at it earlier with the mirror. It looks okay, but it's too far back, and what happens is when you try and pull a collet out, the pin is actually getting hung up on this, and it's actually not doing its job. It's allowing the collet to spin. So you have to kind of jiggle this around until you align the slot again with the pin, and then the collet will drop out. So I was trying to use it for the first couple times, and you know, things weren't going that good, and that was just another thing that kind of frustrated me with that. And once I figured out that that pin needed to be adjusted, I'm going to go ahead and do that now that I got most of the work done. But for the most part, this guy's been working okay. It does have some noise that doesn't sound quite right to me when it's running. It's kind of a ticking, so I'm going to have to take a look at the headstock up here and make sure that it's got the spindle oil in where it needs to, and it's lubed up and everything. I have a feeling that's all it is. The other thing is this, the quill depth stop and everything. It looks like, you know, when you buy these things, they got the cosmoline all over them to prevent stuff from rusting, but it looks like they didn't really clean that off, and they just kind of started using it, because this is just, it's just terrible. It's just got so much of that on there that you can hardly turn this, and then the quick adjustment, you got to really, you know, push it and just kind of futz around with it a little bit. So, you know, I got to take this apart, clean it up real good, and put some light oil on it and get it to where it's working a lot smoother and it's a lot easier to use. But other than that, the mill seems to be in pretty good shape, which is a very good thing, because I had to use it right away for a lot of parts, and for the most part it all worked out okay. The last thing, again, I had stuff to do kind of right away. Within a few days we had to start making parts, and the first day I was starting to work on something, you know, it took a fair bit of time to find anything. I needed like a number 7 drill for a 1/4-20 threaded hole, and you know, I spent 45 minutes looking all over for it. And I was driving home that night, I'm like, this isn't going to work. So what I ended up doing is this mobile cart here with some rollaway drawers. I was sitting in the back over there, and I think it had a few things in it. So I emptied it out, and I basically took everything that I had, which is not a lot. I mean, it's probably 3/4 of what you look at for an apprentice machinist to have. You know, I had a fair amount of stuff, but again, not everything. I took everything and brought it in, and I put it in this cart, and I should have done that. I did that pretty soon, but I should have done that the first day. Just was able to kind of work a lot more efficiently, and you know, brought in all my stuff, my drills and everything. So I didn't have to spend time trying to find drills and things, because a lot of that is missing, or you know, I'm sure it's here somewhere. It's just I got to find it. So doing this was a good thing to do, and I would just wheel this back and forth between where I was working, whether it be the mill or the lathe, and that worked out good. So anyhow, it's been kind of interesting so far. Got most of the parts done that needed to get done. We're probably going to have a little lull in activity, which is good because I'm starting to clean up a little bit in the shop a lot more and get rid of some things. And I've got the machines working well enough to where if something comes in, I can get started. But I do want to spend more time on them. I'm not sure if we're going to be keeping this lathe in the future or not. But I need to see more of the type of things that we're doing here. The mill just needs a few things, like I mentioned earlier, and it should be in good shape. So anyhow, I think that's it for now, and see everybody around.